Imagine this. A CEO of a thriving bakery chain walks into one of his stores, ready to enjoy a simple baguette, but what he hears next shakes him to the core. A trainee, trying their best, is being bullied by a longtime employee. What happens next? You won't believe the shocking decision the CEO makes. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. James Caldwell stood quietly at the counter of one of the busiest bakeries in the city, casually waiting to pick up his order. It was a part of his routine, checking on the store, making sure everything ran smoothly. The smell of freshly baked pastries filled the air, warm and inviting. But today, something was different. As he glanced around, his attention was drawn to a tense exchange between a young intern and an older, longtime employee behind the counter. The intern, clearly new and still struggling to find his rhythm, was working on a batch of pastries. His hands were shaky, and he was taking longer than expected. James watched as the older employee, a man with a sharp, impatient look, grew increasingly frustrated. "You're too slow," the older man barked, his voice rising above the hum of the shop. "How hard is it to follow the instructions? We don't have time for mistakes like this." The intern, his face reddening, stammered out an apology, but his attempt to explain or ask for help only seemed to anger the man further. "I'm sorry, I'll try harder," the intern said quietly, eyes downcast, trying to find the right words. The older employee let out a scoff. "Well, if you're so sorry, then do it right. Don't stand there asking questions. Just do it." He pushed a tray of pastries in the intern's direction, forcing him to take on even more difficult tasks. James watched as the intern's face fell, but he kept working, his hands trembling as he tried to keep up. The older man's voice, sharp and dismissive, rang in his ears. James felt his stomach tighten. He had seen many things in his years running the bakery chain, but this felt wrong. It wasn't just a simple mistake or a bad day, it was the way the older man had treated the intern. The lack of patience, the clear disdain. The intern was new, and yet, he was being given no guidance, no patience, and no respect. James had been in the bakery business long enough to know that such behavior could only lead to one thing: resentment and fear. His mind raced as he considered what he had just witnessed. Was this just a one-time incident? Or was this the kind of attitude that ran deeper, part of a larger problem within the company? James couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this wasn't just about one bad employee. It was about a culture, one where those in power treated newcomers poorly, without regard for their growth or potential. The conflict inside him grew. He couldn't allow this kind of treatment to go unnoticed, especially in a place where people were supposed to feel welcome and respected. But what could he do? How deep did this issue run? Was this behavior something he could address? Or was it just a small, isolated moment? James made a decision. He would stay and watch. He had to know if this was a rare occurrence or if this was happening regularly. He needed to see how this employee interacted with the other staff, especially the newcomers. As he stood there, quietly observing, he noticed the intern being sent to do other menial tasks, his face still clouded with embarrassment. Before he left, James made a mental note to speak with a few of the other workers about what he had seen. He needed more context. Maybe they could shed some light on the situation. James felt a sense of unease grow inside him. This wasn't just about bad management. This was something more fundamental, something that needed to be changed. And he, as the CEO, had to make sure it was. He was determined to find out the truth, to ensure the culture of respect and growth was maintained in his bakery chain. James Caldwell had always prided himself on his ability to keep a pulse on his company. But witnessing the interaction between the veteran employee and the intern had shaken him to his core. It wasn't just the rude words or the dismissive tone, it was the way the older man had treated someone just starting out. Someone eager to learn but clearly out of their depth. James couldn't ignore it. Something had to change. The next day, while the bakery hummed with the usual activity, James took matters into his own hands. He started by observing, quietly watching the interactions between employees. It wasn't long before he saw the same veteran employee, Tom, snapping at another young staff member for no apparent reason. The frustration James had felt the day before only grew as he witnessed this pattern repeating itself. Tom was quick to belittle, slow to teach, and downright hostile when anyone asked questions. James knew he couldn't let this behavior go unnoticed. His gut told him it wasn't just an isolated incident. Tom's behavior might be part of a bigger issue, an issue that could be affecting the entire atmosphere at his beloved bakery chain. He decided to quietly dig deeper, speaking with a few other employees and gathering their thoughts. One by one, he heard the same concerns. Tom wasn't the only one with an attitude problem. There were murmurs about a toxic culture in some parts of the store. New hires, especially interns, were often thrown into high-pressure situations without any guidance. Longtime employees seemed to be following Tom's lead, turning a blind eye to the struggles of their coworkers. James could feel the weight of the situation. As a leader, he knew he couldn't just sweep it under the rug. This was more than just a few bad apples. This was a culture issue that needed immediate attention. But he also knew that making a big move could cause more ripples than he anticipated. What if the rest of the staff revolted? What if his decision led to pushback from those who supported Tom or saw him as a valued member of the team? The conflict inside James was real. He didn't want to create a divide, but he couldn't ignore the fact that a negative environment was starting to take root in his company. As he sat in his office, looking out over the bakery, he made up his mind. This wasn't just about Tom's behavior anymore. It was about ensuring the company he had built over the years continued to thrive with a culture of respect and mutual support. Then, just as he was about to put his plan into motion, an email arrived, a tip from an anonymous source. It was from someone inside the bakery who had seen enough and felt compelled to speak up. The email described in detail several instances where Tom had crossed the line, showing a pattern of bullying behavior that had been tolerated for far too long. The writer even attached evidence, camera footage of Tom's interaction with the intern from the previous day, along with a series of emails where Tom dismissed concerns about training and teamwork. James sat back in his chair, reading the email in silence. This was it, the confirmation he needed. Tom's actions were not a one-off, they were part of a wider problem. This wasn't just about one man's behavior. It was about the culture of the bakery, the way employees treated each other, and how the company's values were being overlooked in favor of speed and efficiency. James knew that he couldn't ignore it any longer. He immediately called for an urgent meeting with his senior team. They needed to address the issue head-on. There was no more time for hesitation. James was determined to confront Tom and anyone else who had been contributing to this toxic culture. It was time for a change, not just for Tom, but for the entire team. James could feel the gravity of his decision, but it was the right one. That afternoon, James called a company-wide meeting. His voice was steady but firm as he addressed the entire team, which included Tom and the intern, who now sat nervously near the back of the room. He began by acknowledging the hard work everyone had put in to make the bakery a success. But then, without hesitation, he shifted the tone of the meeting. "I've been watching, listening, and I've learned that there are things happening in this company that cannot be ignored," James said, his eyes scanning the room. "We are a team, and every single one of you deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. That means no one, no matter how long they've been here, is allowed to treat others poorly, especially not the ones who are just learning the ropes." The room went quiet. The interns exchanged uncomfortable glances, and Tom shifted in his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Tom," James continued, his voice even but unwavering, "your actions have not gone unnoticed. Your behavior toward the interns and new staff is unacceptable. You are here to guide, not to belittle. I expect better, and the rest of this company deserves better from you." The tension in the room grew thick. James could feel the eyes of everyone on him, the weight of their expectations pressing down. He had no intention of backing down. This was not just about one incident. This was about creating a space where people could grow, thrive, and feel respected. "As of today, Tom, I am letting you go," James said, his words landing with finality. "This kind of behavior is not welcome here, and it's time for a change. We will be launching a new training program for everyone, focused on respect, teamwork, and creating an environment where all employees can feel safe and supported." And to the rest of you, I expect you to embrace these changes with open arms." The room was still. The staff looked between each other, some with relief, others with unease. James could feel the weight of the decision in the air, but he knew it was necessary. He wasn't just ending one person's behavior, he was reshaping the future of the bakery. After a long pause, he added, "This is just the beginning. We are going to make sure that everyone, from the most experienced to the newest intern, is given the tools to succeed. This bakery will thrive on respect and collaboration, and I will personally ensure that no one is left behind." James left the meeting room feeling a mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. He knew this was just the first step in a much larger journey. But he was confident in his decision. His company would not just survive, it would thrive on a foundation of respect and teamwork. The following day, the bakery was filled with a sense of tension that was almost palpable. James Caldwell, the CEO, had just called an emergency meeting with all employees, from the longtime staff to the newest intern. As the employees gathered in the small back room, whispers filled the air. No one knew the exact reason for the sudden call, but rumors spread like wildfire. Some guessed it was about new policies. Others speculated it had to do with the store's performance. But no one dared to ask directly. The air was thick with anticipation. James entered the room with a calm, collected demeanor. His presence alone commanded attention. But today, there was something different about him. His face was serious, more focused than usual. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Without a word, he motioned for the projector to be turned on. The room fell silent as the first images flashed across the screen. It was a video feed from the previous day, captured by the security cameras. The footage showed Tom, the veteran employee, in the middle of a heated exchange with the intern. The younger man, struggling with the task at hand, was clearly under pressure. And then, the harsh words came. Words that no one should have to hear, let alone be subjected to in a place of work. "Why are you so slow? You think you're the only one working here?" Tom's voice was sharp and cutting, echoed in the quiet room. The camera zoomed in on the intern, his face a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. He tried to apologize, to explain himself, but Tom wasn't having it. He shoved more work onto the intern's desk, muttering under his breath as he walked away. James paused the video. The room was dead quiet, all eyes on him. He turned his gaze to Tom, who was sitting uncomfortably in the front row. "What do you have to say for yourself?" James asked, his voice steady but firm. Tom's expression didn't change. He crossed his arms, refusing to look anyone in the eye. "I was just doing my job. We don't have time to babysit people who can't keep up," he muttered, clearly defensive. James couldn't hide his disappointment. "You're not babysitting anyone, Tom. You're here to teach, to guide. That's what a mentor does. Not belittle someone who's trying to learn." His words were deliberate, but he could feel the rising tension in the room. Tom scoffed, shaking his head. "It's a tough job, James. We're here to make money, not to coddle people who can't handle the pressure. The customer's the priority, and if they're waiting, it's a problem." The other employees shifted in their seats, some visibly uncomfortable, others trying to avoid making eye contact. James noticed a few of the newer staff members were looking at Tom, their faces a mix of unease and apprehension. This wasn't the environment he wanted to foster. "Your focus may be on getting things done quickly, but at what cost?" James continued, his voice rising slightly. "You think that's what matters? Quick service? It's the attitude behind that service that shapes the customer's experience. Do you think this culture of fear, of pushing people down, is going to make this company thrive?" Tom's face reddened as he sat back in his chair. He was clearly losing his grip. "I'm just saying, you can't let people slow you down. We're a business, not a daycare." James leaned forward, locking eyes with Tom. "That's where you're wrong. This is a daycare for people's growth. If you're not helping them grow, then you're hurting the company." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. The room was still, no one moved, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. A voice broke the silence. It was Emily, one of the younger employees who had witnessed Tom's behavior on more than one occasion. She stood up slowly, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was firm as she spoke. "I've seen Tom do this before. I've seen him talk to others like this too. It's not just with the intern. It happens with everyone new. I didn't say anything before because I didn't think it was my place. But I can't just sit here and watch this anymore. James nodded, his eyes softening as he turned to Emily. Thank you for speaking up. It's not easy, but you've done the right thing. Then he addressed the room. This isn't just about one person's actions. This reflects the culture we've built here. A culture that needs to change. And fast. He stood up and looked directly at Tom. I'm sorry, but your behavior is no longer acceptable here. I'm letting you go effective immediately. There was a sharp intake of breath from some of the employees. And a few exchanged glances. Tom, his face flushed with anger, opened his mouth to speak. But James cut him off. You can defend your actions all you want. But this isn't just about you. It's about what's best for the company and its people. Tom's jaw tightened, and he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He looked around the room, his eyes narrowing at his coworkers. You'll regret this, James. I'll make sure everyone knows how you're running this place. You can't fire me and expect everyone to just fall in line. But James stood tall, unwavering. The decision is made. Your time here is over. As Tom stormed out of the room, James turned to the rest of the staff. The tension in the room was thick, but there was a sense of relief in the air too. We've got work to do. This is just the beginning. We're starting a new program today. A training program focused on respect, customer service, and communication. And I want everyone to participate. This isn't just about how we do things. It's about how we treat each other. And that starts now. The employees were silent for a moment, processing the change, the uncertainty, the shift in the air. James knew this wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be challenging. But this was a step in the right direction. He couldn't let the culture of fear and disrespect take hold of his company. Not on his watch. In the days following Tom's dismissal, James Caldwell observed his bakery chain more closely than ever. His decision to let Tom go had stirred things up. But it was necessary. James knew that one bad apple could spoil the whole bunch. But he also understood that the real work lay ahead, shaping a company culture that fostered respect and growth for all its employees. Not just the ones who'd been around for years. The task was daunting. James knew that Tom's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. The underlying issues ran deeper. To confirm his suspicions, he ordered a comprehensive review of the work processes across all branches. He needed to determine whether the same toxic behavior was permeating other locations, and how far-reaching this problem truly was. A few days later, he met with the department heads from other stores. He made it clear that this wasn't just about improving customer service or speed, it was about fostering a healthy, supportive work environment where everyone, regardless of tenure, was treated with respect. Some department heads nodded in agreement, but others were more hesitant. I understand the need for change, one of the managers said, a man named Roger, who had been with the company for over 20 years. But we've always operated this way. People get in, do the work, and that's that. We don't need to hold hands. James could sense the resistance in his voice. Roger and a few others clearly felt that the new policies, especially the focus on soft skills and team building, were unnecessary. For them, as long as the job got done, the attitude behind it didn't matter. It was a familiar attitude in business. But James wasn't willing to let it slide. He had always believed that success wasn't just about what was done, but how it was done. A company could sell the best products, but if the culture wasn't right, if the people didn't feel valued, then that success was only temporary. He needed the team to understand that a toxic work environment would ultimately poison productivity, morale, and customer satisfaction. Despite the resistance, James made a point of pushing forward with his plans. He implemented weekly check-ins with managers, asking for updates on employee satisfaction and progress with the new training programs. But even so, the skepticism lingered. It was especially evident among the veteran employees, those who had been with the company long enough to have a comfortable understanding of how things worked until now. There were grumbles, whispers in the break room. Several employees expressed concerns to their managers, hinting that James was pushing too hard too fast. The fear was palpable. Would they be forced to change their ways? Would the new training programs truly make a difference? Some of the older employees saw it as a passing phase. just a knee-jerk reaction to one bad incident. They doubted the new direction would stick, especially since they had been doing just fine the way they always had. But one employee's resistance would soon become a turning point. A senior staff member named Linda, known for her blunt demeanor and no-nonsense attitude, had been one of the loudest critics of the new training. "This is just a waste of time," she'd said during a meeting, her arms crossed defiantly. "We're here to work, not to sit through lectures on how to smile at customers. Who cares about attitude if the job's getting done?" Linda's words echoed in James's mind. But what happened next caught him by surprise. In a routine audit of one of the stores, he discovered that Linda had been involved in an incident where she had ignored company procedures during a customer interaction, leading to a lost order and dissatisfied customer. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a direct violation of the standards the company had set for customer service. James felt a wave of frustration, but also clarity. This was the problem. Linda was one of the best performers in terms of output, but she had failed to adapt to the evolving demands of the business. Her dismissive attitude toward customer service and teamwork was damaging, not just to the brand, but to the morale of the team. He didn't waste time. James called Linda into his office the next morning. He had no intention of firing her, at least, not yet. He wanted to address the deeper issue, her lack of willingness to adapt and the implications it had for the future of the company. "Linda," James began, his tone calm but firm, "I've reviewed the incident that took place last week, and I've seen how you handled it. You've been here for a long time, and you're a great worker. But your approach to customer service is outdated. The company can't afford to lose customers over a mistake like that, especially when it could have been avoided with just a little more effort and attention." Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I did what I had to do to get the job done. I didn't think it was that big a deal." "It is a big deal," James said, his voice steady. "This isn't about getting the job done. This is about ensuring that every customer who walks through that door has the best possible experience. And that starts with how we treat each other and how we treat them. You've always been a valued member of this team, but if you can't adapt to the changes, I'm afraid you'll be left behind." Linda was silent for a moment. James could see the wheels turning in her head. He knew she wasn't going to change overnight, but he hoped this conversation would plant a seed. James didn't stop with Linda. He decided to ramp up the employee evaluations and make them more transparent. It wasn't enough just to talk about attitude and respect. He needed clear metrics to measure how the company was evolving. He began requiring employees to attend additional soft skill workshops and focused more on one-on-one feedback sessions. Weeks passed, and while the road wasn't without bumps, the results started to show. New hires felt more welcomed, and the existing team began to improve their interactions. Even Linda, though resistant, started to show some improvement. She wasn't exactly embracing the changes with open arms, but there was a noticeable shift in her approach. For James, this was a sign of progress. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much work to be done, but he could feel the momentum building. Employees were starting to see that this wasn't about being forced to change. It was about creating an environment where everyone could succeed, together. He looked around the office one evening, reflecting on how far the company had come in such a short time. The challenges ahead were still significant, but James felt more confident than ever. The bakery was on the right path, and while there would always be obstacles, he knew he was taking the necessary steps to ensure it would continue to thrive. James Caldwell walked through the bakery early one morning, the hum of machinery and the chatter of workers already filling the space. It had been several weeks since the meeting that had led to Tom's dismissal, and James had kept a close eye on how the changes were taking shape. The new training programs had been rolled out across the company, focusing not just on customer service but also on communication skills. It wasn't just about teaching people how to do their jobs, it was about reshaping the culture of the company, ensuring that respect and professionalism were the foundation of every interaction. At first, it seemed like things were improving. The employees were communicating more openly, discussing the changes, and asking for clarification when needed. The awkwardness that had once defined some of the interactions between staff and management was starting to fade. James watched as the team worked together more seamlessly, and the energy in the bakery was lighter, more collaborative. However, as much as things were changing, there was still a sense of reluctance in the air. Some of the longtime employees, especially those who had been around for years, seemed to feel the weight of the changes more heavily. It wasn't that they were opposed to the new policies, it was more that they felt their old ways were being questioned. The ease they once took for granted, the pace at which they'd worked in the past, was no longer the standard. Now, there was an expectation that they'd adjust, and that pressure seemed to make them more defensive. James understood the resistance. Change was hard, especially when it felt like everything you'd known for years was being upended. He knew there were challenges ahead, but he also knew these were necessary challenges. He wanted to create an environment where everyone, no matter how long they'd been with the company, had a chance to improve and grow. But some of his veteran staff didn't share that same belief. A few employees, though, did seem to embrace the new culture with open arms. The interns, especially, thrived. They appreciated the structure, the open communication, and the clear expectations. They saw the bakery as a place where they could learn, where they could contribute without fear of being belittled or ignored. It was refreshing for James to see these new faces taking initiative, engaging with the training, and, most importantly, feeling valued. Still, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. In one of the company-wide surveys he'd implemented, a handful of employees expressed positive feedback about the changes. But a more troubling trend began to emerge. There were reports of quiet, behind-the-scenes dissatisfaction. Some staff members were saying one thing in public and something very different in private. As he sifted through the survey responses, James found that a few long-term employees were still organizing closed-door meetings, sharing concerns about the training programs, and encouraging others to return to the old way of doing things. These meetings were quiet rebellions, gathering those who didn't quite believe in the new direction, who still thought the bakery had been fine the way it was. James felt a pang of frustration. He had hoped that time and results would show the benefits of these changes. But the resistance was persistent. One of the senior supervisors, in particular, had been vocal about his discontent. Roger, a longtime employee, had become one of the most outspoken critics of the new culture. "It's all fluff," Roger had said in private conversations. "We don't need all this touchy-feely stuff. People should just do their jobs." James knew he had to act fast. He couldn't afford to let these undercurrents of negativity threaten the company's growth. The change had to be reinforced, and it needed to come from the top down. He called for an urgent meeting with all the senior managers and department heads. It was time to discuss how they would keep the momentum going and ensure that the changes weren't just surface level but embedded deep into the company's core. The meeting room was tense as James sat across from his management team. He could see the unease in their eyes. Some were still holding onto the old way of doing things, reluctant to fully embrace what was now expected of them. "We need to make sure everyone is on the same page," James began. "We've started something important here, but it won't stick unless we all commit to it. I need you to understand that this isn't just about training programs or new policies. This is about building a culture that lasts, one that values respect, teamwork, and continuous growth. I need your help to make that happen." Roger, seated at the table, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I get it, James, but don't you think we're going a little overboard with these training sessions? We're spending more time talking about feelings than we are about serving customers and keeping things running smoothly." James could see Roger's resistance, but he also saw an opportunity. He needed to change Roger's mindset without alienating him. "Roger, I know this isn't easy for you, but the truth is, when we focus only on the task at hand and forget about how we treat each other, we lose the heart of what makes this company special. It's not just about making products. It's about making people feel valued, both our customers and our team members. And if we don't build that trust and respect into everything we do, it will affect our business, whether we see it right away or not." The room was silent for a moment. James could feel the weight of his words settle in. He wasn't asking for a revolution, just for an open-minded approach, one that would include all employees in the journey towards something better. James also made a decision to strengthen the company's feedback system. It wasn't enough to simply implement a training program. He needed a way to measure its success in real, tangible terms. From now on, Performance reviews would be tied directly to how well employees embraced these new values. No more just checking boxes for completed tasks. Now, employees would be assessed on their communication, their teamwork, and their attitude. These metrics would guide the future of the bakery. Going forward, I want you all to participate in leadership training. James continued. This isn't just for the new hires. It's for everyone. I need you to lead by example. To show that change can come from the top. You can't expect your teams to embrace these values if you're not doing it yourself. James left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. It wasn't going to be an easy journey, and there was no guarantee that every employee would fall in line. But he could see the beginning of a shift, especially among the newer staff members who were eager for a fresh start. As the days passed, he saw small but significant changes. Employees started to feel more comfortable voicing their concerns. The awkwardness was slowly replaced by collaboration. The bakery was beginning to feel like a place where everyone, no matter their position, was working toward the same goal. James knew this was just the beginning. The real test would come in the weeks and months ahead. But for now, he felt confident that the seeds for lasting change had been planted. James Caldwell had been monitoring the progress of the company's reforms carefully. It had been several months since the initial changes had begun, and he could sense a shift in the atmosphere across the bakery chain. Employees were beginning to show a more positive attitude. The tension that had once been so palpable in the work environment was slowly dissipating. People were talking to each other more openly, communicating across roles that had previously been divided by hierarchy. It was small, but it was progress. To keep things on track, James had organized regular check-ins with department heads to discuss the effectiveness of the new training programs and evaluate employee satisfaction with the changes. He wanted to make sure the improvements were not just superficial. He needed the cultural shift to take hold. Deep within the company, as he sat in these meetings, he could see the difference. Employees seemed more comfortable, more confident. They felt like their voices mattered. However, not everyone was as quick to embrace the new way of working. Some of the longtime employees still couldn't fully accept the changes. They'd been doing things a certain way for so long, and now, it felt as if the foundation of their work was being pulled out from under them. They missed the old methods, the ones that, in their eyes, had kept things running smoothly for years. The changes to customer service practices and employee training were especially difficult to swallow. To these veterans, it seemed like the company was losing its traditional values they had worked so hard to uphold. James understood that these long-standing employees were struggling. He knew it wouldn't be easy to change habits that had been ingrained over decades. But he also knew that the company couldn't thrive in a stagnant culture. Something had to give. The problem was, he didn't want to make these employees feel alienated or overlooked. But at the same time, the changes had to continue. His vision for the company depended on it. Despite his efforts to involve everyone in the process, a quiet resistance began to form. A handful of veteran employees, particularly those who had worked in the company for more than 10 years, started to quietly undermine the new practices. They didn't speak out openly, but their actions, slower compliance, whispered complaints during breaks, made it clear they were dissatisfied. Their resistance wasn't loud or obvious, but it was enough to create friction in the workflow. James had always known that any change would face challenges, but this more subtle form of opposition was something he hadn't fully anticipated. One employee, in particular, caught his attention: Roger, a senior supervisor who had been with the company for over 15 years. Roger had been part of the early discussions about the new training programs. And while he hadn't outwardly opposed them, James noticed his attitude beginning to shift. He started to show signs of being less cooperative in meetings. He often dismissed new training ideas and suggested that the company was straying too far from its roots. It became increasingly clear to James that Roger's resistance wasn't just personal, it was influencing others. During one of the weekly department meetings, Roger had become particularly vocal about the training sessions. "I don't know why we're spending so much time on this," Roger had said, his voice edged with frustration. "Our customers want their orders on time. They don't care if we smile or talk about teamwork. This training is wasting our time." James felt a knot form in his stomach as he heard Roger's words. He knew it was time to address this head-on. Roger had always been a valuable part of the team, But this kind of attitude was dangerous. It could undermine everything James had worked so hard to implement. The next day, James asked Roger to meet with him in his office. The tension between them was thick as Roger walked in. His arms crossed, clearly ready for a confrontation. James wasted no time. "Roger, I've been noticing that you've been more vocal about the training programs and some of the new policies." James started. "I need you to be upfront with me. What's going on?" Roger shifted in his seat, his expression defensive. "James, look, I've been doing this job for over 15 years. I've seen what works. You can't just change everything overnight and expect it to stick. People don't need to sit through workshops to know how to do their job. We're running a business, not a therapy session." James listened quietly. He understood Roger's frustration, but it was clear that his resistance was rooted in something deeper, perhaps fear of change. Or maybe a lack of trust in the new direction. "Roger, I appreciate everything you've done for this company," James said, his voice steady but firm. "But this company isn't just about getting things done, it's about how we do things. We can't ignore the way we treat each other and our customers. I need you to understand that these changes are not just a passing phase. They're here to stay." Roger didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke in a quieter tone. "I just don't know if this will work. People don't want it. They don't want to change." James leaned forward, his eyes meeting Roger's. "I can't force anyone to change. But I can make sure we build a culture where respect and collaboration are at the core. If you're not on board with that, I don't know if you can continue in this role." Roger's face tightened, but after a long pause, he finally nodded. He didn't agree, but he understood. James knew this wouldn't be the last of it. But this confrontation was necessary. Not just for Roger, but for the entire company. He had to make it clear that anyone who resisted the change wouldn't be allowed to drag the team down. To reinforce the message, James decided to implement a more rigorous performance review system. It wouldn't be enough just to check the boxes anymore. Employees needed to be held accountable for not only their work but also their behavior and attitudes. He made it clear that any employees who resisted the changes would have to attend a mandatory retraining session, or they could face disciplinary action. It wasn't an easy decision, but James knew it was the right one. The company was moving forward, and no one could be left behind. Over the next few weeks, the changes began to show results. Despite the pushback, there was progress. Employees who had initially resisted the new policies started to adapt. Even Roger, though begrudgingly, began to soften. More importantly, James saw a noticeable shift in the newer staff members, particularly the interns. They felt more empowered, and their excitement for their work was contagious. James had a long way to go, but the foundation had been set. The bakery was becoming a place where people could thrive, not just because of their work, but because they felt respected and valued. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, James felt a glimmer of hope that the changes he had set in motion were the right ones. The days following the confrontation with Roger, the senior supervisor, were filled with a strange mixture of hope and tension. James Caldwell had expected some resistance. It was to be expected when any company underwent significant change. But what James hadn't anticipated was how deeply the resistance ran, how it had begun to spread among the veteran staff. What had started with a single outspoken employee now seemed like a quiet undercurrent that was affecting the entire team. As he walked through the store, James could feel the weight of this unspoken pushback. Employees who had once been eager and motivated now seemed hesitant. Their eyes avoided his as they went about their tasks. Their interactions with one another more curt, more distant. The positive energy that had been building after the first rounds of training seemed to be fading, replaced by a quiet skepticism. James had a sense that something was off. The words spoken in the meetings seemed to reflect more than just individual discomfort. They were part of something larger. Something that had been festering beneath the surface. It wasn't just Roger who was resistant anymore. It seemed as if a portion of the team, particularly those who had been with the company the longest, were now questioning the new direction. They were starting to voice concerns in private, whispers in the break room about the increased pressure and the need to adapt to new policies. "It's too much," they said. "The pace is too fast. It's all these changes for nothing." James heard these concerns through various channels, some directly, some through other employees who came to him with concerns of their own. It was clear that a significant portion of the long-standing team was feeling overwhelmed by the shift in priorities. As a result, James decided to take a more personal approach. He knew that he needed to get to the root of the problem and understand what exactly was causing this unrest. Instead of waiting for the issues to grow into something unmanageable, he began holding one-on-one meetings with each department. He wanted to hear directly from the employees who were struggling to accept the new policies, to give them an opportunity to share their frustrations openly. The first meeting was with Linda, a veteran employee who had been with the company for over 10 years. Linda had always been a steady presence in the bakery, her experience invaluable in running the day-to-day operations. But even she seemed on edge lately. "I've been doing this job for a long time, James," Linda began, her voice strained but polite. "And I get what you're trying to do. I do. But these new policies? They're a bit much. You can't expect everyone to just change overnight. It's not realistic." James nodded, understanding her point. Change, especially on this scale, was never easy. "I understand that it's tough," he said, "but the point of these changes is not just to increase efficiency or speed. It's about creating a better environment for everyone. It's about making sure we treat each other with respect, whether we're serving a customer or working alongside a teammate." Linda sighed. "I get that, but it feels like we're losing what made us successful in the first place. The things that worked for us all these years are suddenly being tossed aside. It's hard to see the value in these changes when we've been doing just fine without them." James could sense her reluctance to fully embrace the new direction. It wasn't just Linda, it was others too. Those who had been in the company long enough to feel that the older way of doing things was still viable. They didn't see the need for such drastic changes. After his meeting with Linda, James continued to meet with more employees. He was hearing the same sentiments repeated over and over. The resistance wasn't just about the policies, it was about a deeper, more fundamental clash of cultures. The veteran employees felt that the company's traditional values were being threatened by the push for change. They feared losing their sense of identity, the comfort they had in the way things had always been. But things took an unexpected turn when James received an anonymous email a few days later. The message was short but impactful. The employee, who claimed to be one of the older staff members, admitted to feeling the pressure from the new policies but also confessed that some of the more resistant employees had begun to spread misinformation about the changes. "They've been telling others that the new policies are a waste of time." The email read, "They say the company is turning into something unrecognizable, and they're encouraging people to ignore the training and continue working as we always have." James felt a surge of both frustration and clarity. This wasn't just passive resistance, it was active sabotage. A group of employees was undermining the efforts he had put into place, creating confusion and fostering dissent. He realized that, at this point, he wasn't just facing resistance from a few individuals, he was facing a battle for the company's future. Determined to address the issue head-on, James called an emergency meeting with the senior staff. He needed to confront this head-on before it escalated any further. The meeting was set for the next morning. As the senior management gathered around the table, James's tone was calm but unwavering. He wasn't here to negotiate, he was here to set things straight. "I've been made aware of the growing resistance to the changes we've implemented. This is more than just discomfort with the new policies, it's undermining the very foundation of the company." James began, "I will not allow this to happen. If we are going to move forward, we need to all be on the same page." There was a shift in the room as the managers exchanged looks. Some of them, particularly the veterans, looked uncomfortable. James continued, "I understand that change is hard, but it is necessary. We can't afford to fall back on old habits that have held us back for so long. We need everyone to buy in, everyone." Roger, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "James, I've been with this company for over 15 years. I've seen a lot of changes. And I get it. Things need to evolve. But I still don't think we're going about this the right way. We're pushing too hard, too fast." James locked eyes with Roger. "I appreciate your years of service, Roger, but the company needs to evolve. If you're not willing to be part of that evolution, we're going to have a serious problem." The tension in the room was thick, but James's resolve was unshaken. He had to stand firm in his decision. I want to make this clear, James said, his voice steady. Anyone who is unwilling to fully engage with the changes, anyone who is still actively trying to sabotage these efforts, will face consequences. This is about the future of the company. And if you can't get on board with that, we'll have to make some difficult decisions. The meeting ended with no more words of resistance. But the atmosphere was heavy. James knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to take whatever steps were necessary to protect the integrity of the company. He couldn't let a few dissenting voices derail everything he had worked for. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the bakery shifted once again. James continued to monitor the progress closely, conducting one-on-one meetings with employees and ensuring that those who had resisted were held accountable. Some employees started to fall in line, understanding the importance of the changes, while others continued to push back, testing the boundaries. James knew he couldn't rest until the company's culture fully embraced the changes. But as each day passed, he felt more confident that the path he was on would lead to a stronger, more unified bakery. It wasn't going to be easy. But with every challenge, James felt more certain of one thing. He was doing the right thing for the future of the company. The day of the meeting had arrived, and the air in the bakery was thick with anticipation. James Caldwell had already known that the resistance within the company wasn't something that could be swept aside with a few changes. It was deeper, more ingrained, and it had spread to a larger portion of his staff. The meeting would not only address the open dissent but also attempt to answer why some of his most seasoned employees were still struggling with the changes he was trying to implement. The room was filled with a mixture of longtime employees and those newer to the company. James had made it clear that he wanted all of them to attend, especially those who had voiced their opposition to the changes. As he walked into the conference room, he felt the weight of the moment. There was no turning back now. He started the meeting by acknowledging the hard work of everyone in the room. I know that change can be difficult, and I know that many of you have worked here for years, helping to make this company what it is today. But we've reached a point where we can't stay stagnant. We need to grow, we need to evolve, and we need to do it together. There was a noticeable silence in the room, followed by a few uneasy shifts in seats. James could see the skepticism in their eyes. Many of them had been here for years, decades in some cases, and had seen changes come and go. But this felt different to them. To some, it felt like the very foundation of what they had known and trusted was being shaken. One of the senior employees, a woman in her late 50s named Claire, spoke up. James, I've been with this company for over 30 years, and I've seen all kinds of changes. But what you're doing now, it feels like we're losing the heart of what made this company great. It's not just about customer service or efficiency, it's about values. You're changing things so fast. And for some of us, it's hard to see where we fit in this new vision. James knew this wasn't just about policy, it was about values. As Claire had said, he had tried to make his reasons clear to the staff. But the older employees were clinging to a sense of tradition. They saw these changes as a threat, as if the company was moving away from the core values that had once made it strong. I understand, Claire, James said, his voice calm but firm. But the truth is, the company we knew 20 or 30 years ago doesn't exist in the same way anymore. The world has changed, and so must we. The values we have are still important, but we need to modernize how we work with each other, with our customers, and how we approach our roles. A murmur ran through the room. Some employees nodded, but others looked unconvinced. Then, another longtime employee, Robert, a quiet but influential member of the team, added, I think the real issue here is the lack of support. We've been asked to change, but there hasn't been enough guidance. It's hard to jump into something new when you're not sure what's expected of you. James took a deep breath. Robert's words hit hard because they were true. The lack of structured support during the rollout of the new policies had left a gap that many of the employees were now filling with doubt. I hear you, Robert, James said, his voice softer now, a recognition in his tone. This change has been abrupt for many of you, and I didn't realize how much we had skipped over in terms of support and guidance. I'm committed to making sure we do this properly, and that means not just the policies, but giving you the tools and resources you need to feel confident in them. But there was more to this. As James listened to his employees, He began to realize that the issue wasn't just about new policies. It wasn't even just about the resistance to change. There was a deeper, more fundamental problem: the lack of clarity in career progression, the absence of clear growth opportunities, and the way certain employees felt overlooked. These were all aspects that James hadn't fully considered. In the middle of the conversation, one of the more outspoken employees, Angela, spoke up. She was one of the newer hires, and she had seen firsthand the effects of the changes in company culture. "I've seen the benefits of these changes. I'm not saying everything is perfect, but I feel more valued than I ever did in my previous job. But I do think we're missing something: career development. We talk about customer service, but we also need to be talking about employee development. How are we supposed to grow in our careers if we don't have the right path?" Her words hung in the air. James felt the weight of them. It was a realization he hadn't fully grasped before, but now it seemed so obvious. Without providing employees with clear growth opportunities, without showing them that there was more to look forward to than just their daily tasks, the changes in culture were only going to be temporary. It wasn't enough to change the way people worked. It was time to change the way they saw their future in the company. "Thank you, Angela," James said, his eyes meeting hers. "You're absolutely right. And that's where I've failed. I've focused so much on the immediate changes, on customer service and team dynamics, that I overlooked the importance of career development. We need to integrate that into our training. And we need to make sure that every single one of you knows what the next step is in your career here." With that realization, the room began to shift. The employees who had been most vocal about their discontent now seemed to soften. Considering the point James had made, yes, the changes were difficult. Yes, the pace had been faster than they were used to. But now, there was hope that these changes weren't just about throwing out the old and bringing in the new. They were about making the company better, more inclusive, more supportive, more forward-thinking. "I want us to be a company where everyone feels like they're a part of the team," James continued, "where each of you can grow and find your place here. That means giving you the resources, the training, and the opportunities to succeed. And that's not just a company policy, it's my commitment to each of you." The meeting ended on a note of cautious optimism. There was still a long road ahead, but James felt the shift in the room. The employees who had been skeptical were now more open, more willing to listen. They weren't fully on board yet, but they could see that James was serious about making things right. James left the room feeling a quiet sense of relief. He knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they were on the right track, not just toward improving the company's culture but toward ensuring that every employee had the chance to grow and thrive. The changes he was making were difficult, but they were necessary, and he was determined to make them last. After the heated meeting that addressed much of the resistance within the bakery chain, James Caldwell had hoped things would settle down. The tension in the air had been palpable, but he knew that real change never came easily. The long-term employees who had been vocally resistant were starting to shift their perspective. Albeit slowly, but despite his efforts, James could still sense the undercurrent of dissent. The atmosphere, while better, was still fragile. Over the next few weeks, James observed a slow but noticeable change. The more open communication policies were taking hold, and a few longtime employees began to participate more actively in the training sessions. They had begun to see the value in some of the changes. Though it wasn't a perfect transformation, still, there was progress. Yet, there was a small group within the workforce that remained steadfast in their opposition. They hadn't fully embraced the new way of doing things. In fact, James noticed that this group seemed to be quietly undermining the changes, subtly sowing seeds of doubt among their colleagues. They were careful not to make too much noise, but it was clear that they didn't believe in the new direction the company was headed. James knew that if this group wasn't addressed soon, it could prevent the changes from becoming permanent. These employees were spreading negativity, particularly to the newer hires, encouraging them to bypass the training programs and ignore the revised policies. Their attitude was one of quiet sabotage, and James realized that this was more than just individual resistance. It was a concerted effort to derail the company's progress. One afternoon, James received an unexpected message, a tip from an anonymous source within the company. The email was brief, but its implications were clear. The sender revealed that there was a faction of senior employees organizing quietly behind the scenes, talking about a strike or public protest to pressure James into backing down from the changes. The email also pointed out that a veteran supervisor, Steve, had become the leader of this movement. The source warned James that this could escalate quickly if not handled properly. James sat back in his office, the weight of the situation settling in. It wasn't just about policies anymore. This had become a battle over the future of the company. The resistance wasn't merely uncomfortable with change, it was actively fighting it. But what troubled James most was that these employees were trying to manipulate others into following their lead, undermining the trust and unity he had been working so hard to rebuild. Knowing that this couldn't continue, James called an emergency meeting with his top management team. He needed to figure out how to handle this growing issue. The meeting was tense. James could see the concern in their eyes. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to let this go unchallenged. "Here's what's going on," James started, his voice firm but measured. "We have a small group of employees who are actively trying to derail the progress we've made. They're spreading misinformation about the training programs. And now we have talk of a strike. This can't continue. We need to address this issue head on." A heavy silence fell over the room. Steve, one of the senior supervisors, was in the meeting. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat as James's eyes landed on him. There was no denying it. Steve had become a leader in the group resisting change. And his influence was starting to spread among the others. James leaned forward, his gaze unflinching. "Steve, I know you've been vocal about your dissatisfaction with the changes. But this isn't about personal preference anymore. This is about the future of this company. I need you to explain why you think undermining the new policies is the right move." Steve shifted again, his face reddening as he spoke. "James, I've been here for more years than I care to count. This company was built on a certain set of values that are being thrown out the window. You're asking us to change things that have worked for decades. It's too much. I'm not alone in this. A lot of people feel the same way." James understood Steve's frustration, but he could see how this line of thinking was damaging to the company. It wasn't about abandoning values, it was about adapting to the times. "Steve, I respect your loyalty to this company. But we have to evolve. We can't stay stuck in the past. And the values you're referring to, they're still here. What we're changing is how we treat each other, how we grow, and how we move forward as a team. We can't afford to resist progress just because it feels uncomfortable." Steve opened his mouth to respond, but James stopped him. "I've given you all the opportunity to express your concerns. And I've listened, but now it's time for action. We can't let this resistance continue. If you're not willing to work with the team, then we'll have to make some tough decisions." The room grew quiet again. James knew this wouldn't be easy. He had hoped the change would come more gradually. But sometimes, decisive action was necessary. The resistance was deep-rooted, and it had to be dealt with immediately. "I'm calling a meeting with the entire staff tomorrow," James continued. "We're going to address this once and for all. I want to clear up the misunderstandings. And if anyone is still struggling with the changes, I expect you to speak up. But we are moving forward. If you're not on board with that, you need to be honest with me now." James didn't give Steve or anyone else a chance to respond. He had made up his mind. The meeting would happen the next day, and he wasn't going to back down. The following morning, the room was filled with nervous energy. The employees were all present, including the resistors. As James stood before them, he could feel the weight of the moment. This was the final move. "I'm not here to make excuses," James began, his voice steady. "I'm here to tell you that these changes are happening, and they are not going anywhere. We've made mistakes along the way, and I've listened to your concerns. But we are all in this together. If you still have doubts about the future, now is the time to speak up." The room was silent, and James could feel the tension. But he knew this was the moment that would define the company's future. Slowly, one by one, employees began to speak up, not with defiance, but with understanding. Some expressed concerns about the speed of the changes, others about their fears of being left behind. But James could see a shift, a recognition that these changes were necessary, even if uncomfortable. Steve, though still hesitant, finally spoke. "I'm not going to pretend I agree with everything, but I see your point, James. This company can't afford to stay in the past. I'll give it a try. But I need to see a clear path forward for all of us." James smiled, relieved that the conversation had started to turn. "Thank you, Steve. That's all I ask. We're in this together. Let's keep moving forward." As the meeting ended, James felt a wave of exhaustion mixed with hope. The road ahead was still uncertain. But this meeting had been a turning point. The change, though difficult, was beginning to take root. And despite the challenges, James felt more confident than ever that the company was headed in the right direction. The bakery had come a long way since James Caldwell had first started implementing the changes. The signs of improvement were beginning to show in ways that were both visible and measurable. The atmosphere in the stores was noticeably lighter. Employees were communicating more openly, and customers seemed to notice the difference. The team was starting to function like a well-oiled machine, not just in terms of output but in how they interacted with each other and their customers. James had worked hard to create this shift, but he knew that this was just the beginning of a long-term process. To ensure that the changes were truly taking root, James continued to monitor the company's progress closely. He organized regular surveys to gauge employee satisfaction and assess how customers were responding to the new atmosphere. The feedback was generally positive. Employees were more engaged, and customers were noticing the difference in the way they were treated. This, in turn, had led to a subtle but positive impact on sales. However, not all the feedback was glowing. Some of the veteran employees, the ones who had been with the company for many years, still felt uneasy about the new direction. They appreciated the improvements in customer service but felt like the company was moving away from the traditions that had made it successful in the first place. There was a sense among this group that James's changes were eroding the values they had come to cherish in the business. One of the major sticking points was the new performance evaluation system. James had introduced stricter metrics to ensure that employees were not only meeting their job expectations but also contributing to a positive and respectful work environment. These evaluations included factors like teamwork, communication, and attitude, something that had been overlooked in the past. While many embraced the new system, others saw it as overly harsh. A few veteran employees expressed concerns that these evaluations might harm their chances for promotion or recognition. James could understand their concerns, but he knew that the company needed to adapt. If they were going to grow, if they were going to remain competitive, these changes were necessary. But balancing the new policies with the interests of the long-term employees wasn't going to be easy. He had to find a way to ensure that the new system worked for everyone, not just the newer hires who seemed to be thriving under it. One afternoon, James received an unexpected report from an internal source, a veteran employee who had been skeptical of the changes. This employee, however, had come to realize that the new system was working. They reported that a small group of longtime staff members were actively trying to undermine the new performance evaluations. They had been spreading false information about the system, claiming it was unfair and that it was leading to unnecessary pressure on employees. The employee's email was surprising, not just because of the information, but because it was from someone who had been resistant to the changes. This person, seeing the results for themselves, was now offering support to James. "I've seen how the new system is working for the younger employees, and I can see its value." The email read, "But the resistance from some of the older staff is starting to cause problems. I want to help you fix this." James felt a surge of relief. This was exactly the kind of shift he had hoped for. A recognition that the changes weren't just a passing trend but a necessary evolution. He wasn't just pushing for the sake of change, he was trying to ensure that the company could thrive for years to come. The resistance was a natural part of the process. But now it seemed like there were allies even among those who had been most reluctant. The next step was clear. James needed to make sure that everyone in the company, not just the newer employees, understood the importance of these changes. He decided to implement a more comprehensive training program that not only focused on customer service and teamwork but also emphasized career development. The long-standing employees needed to see that the new policies weren't about taking away opportunities for them, they were about creating new ones. He needed to reassure them that the company still valued their years of experience and that the new systems were designed to help them grow, not hinder them. James called another meeting with his senior management team to discuss the next steps. "We've made significant progress," he began, his voice steady. But we need to make sure these changes are sustainable. The next phase is about ensuring that everyone feels included, that everyone understands why these changes are happening. We can't let the resistance hold us back. He also recognized that leadership development was crucial. He couldn't expect the changes to stick if the senior managers weren't fully invested in them. They needed to be the champions of these reforms. We need to start offering leadership training for everyone, especially the managers who have been here the longest. They need to understand the bigger picture and how their leadership plays a role in this new direction. James knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The long-term employees, especially those who had been with the company for decades, had built their own way of doing things. And while some of them had started to see the value in the changes, others were still clinging to the past. He couldn't force them to change their mindset, but he could offer them the tools to help them see the potential in the new approach. A few weeks later, James observed the results of the leadership training he had implemented. There were noticeable improvements in communication and the work environment. Even the long-standing employees, who had been skeptical at first, were beginning to engage more with the new system. They weren't fully on board yet, but they were starting to see the positive effects of the changes, especially in how the company was treating its employees and customers. The most noticeable shift came in the attitudes of the new interns and younger employees. They had embraced the training wholeheartedly and were beginning to take on leadership roles themselves. James could see that the company's future was beginning to take shape. There was still a lot of work to do, but now, there was a foundation of trust, respect, and collaboration that would allow the company to build upon these early successes. James felt a quiet satisfaction as he walked through the bakery one morning. Watching the employees interact, it wasn't perfect, but it was better. The changes had started to take root, and he could see the company moving in the right direction. The road ahead was still filled with challenges, but James knew that as long as he continued to listen, adapt, and led with integrity, the company would continue to grow stronger. The changes had only just begun, but they had already made an impact, and that was just the beginning. A month after the full implementation of the reform programs, James Caldwell received the results of a company-wide report. The figures reflected a noticeable shift. The work environment had stabilized, with a significant reduction in resistance. Employees, especially the longtime staff members who had initially resisted, were gradually adapting to the new systems. The once tense atmosphere was easing as they grew more comfortable with the changes in the workflow. James felt a cautious optimism. Although the changes weren't without their challenges, the company's morale was clearly improving. People were adjusting, and the overall tone of the workplace had become more positive. Yet, as any leader would, James remained wary of the road ahead. Change, he knew, would take time, but there were still lingering issues, particularly with the attitude of some veteran employees who struggled to fully embrace the new vision. However, James's challenges were no longer just internal. He began facing growing pressure from the company's board of directors. Several members were concerned that the changes were having a negative impact on short-term profits. They saw improvements in culture and employee engagement, but they were worried about the immediate financial outcomes. For them, the success of the company was still largely measured by quarterly profits and growth, and the more abstract gains in workplace atmosphere weren't enough to win them over. "I understand the value of these changes, James," said Walter, one of the senior board members, during a tense meeting, "but we need to see results, financial results, sooner rather than later. I'm afraid we may be losing sight of our core mission here." James didn't disagree. He knew that the immediate returns weren't going to be evident right away. But he also understood that without a positive company culture, any short-term profits would eventually lead to burnout, turnover, and a decline in service quality. The board, however, wasn't seeing it that way. As the pressure mounted, James began to question how sustainable the new direction really was. Could the company maintain a profitable trajectory while also nurturing this new culture? Could the balance be struck between employee satisfaction and financial performance? The answer came unexpectedly during one of the company's quarterly board meetings. James had prepared a presentation with statistics about employee satisfaction and early indications that the new training programs were leading to improvements in performance. But what truly surprised him was the unexpected support he received from one of the newer executives, Victoria, who had recently joined the company. Victoria had spent years in the corporate world, working with companies that had struggled with both growth and employee engagement. She was quick to see the value in James's vision for the company and presented her own report to the board. What we're seeing is not just about short-term gains. This company is building a brand that customers can trust and employees can grow with. That's worth more than an immediate uptick in profits. When employees feel valued and respected, they work harder, and they stay longer. This will pay off in the long run. Victoria's report detailed how the positive work environment was already leading to higher productivity, lower turnover, and even an increase in customer satisfaction. Her findings showed a clear correlation between the company's cultural shifts and the improvements in operational efficiency. This detailed, data-driven perspective gave the board a clearer picture of the long-term benefits James had been championing all along. For James, this was a turning point. Not only did Victoria's support validate his approach, but it also helped shift some of the board's perspective. He realized that the changes, while not immediately visible in profit margins, had significant potential to build a sustainable brand that could weather the ups and downs of the business world. The trust and loyalty cultivated in employees would eventually extend to the customers they served. Still, James knew that the journey was far from over. He couldn't afford to sit back and relax just because the winds had shifted. The board had agreed to continue supporting the changes, but James understood that true success would come from making these changes permanent. The company needed a foundation built on more than just improved morale. It needed structure, leadership development, and a clear path forward. Determined to keep pushing forward, James focused on the long-term vision. He knew that to create lasting change, he would need to continue improving employee development opportunities. The next phase would involve more than just customer service training. It would require real, tangible career development programs for employees at all levels. He began to implement clear, structured pathways for advancement. We need to show people that there is more for them here than just a job, James said to his senior team. We need to offer more than just training. We need to help them see a future with us. That's how we will build loyalty, by helping them grow. He also turned his attention to strengthening the company's brand identity. He recognized that the changes within the company needed to be reflected outwardly to customers. James's next move was to work with the marketing team to develop a branding strategy that emphasized the company's new culture, one of respect, growth, and community. As the weeks went on, the signs of success began to emerge. Employees felt more empowered, and customer satisfaction continued to climb. James was particularly pleased with the feedback from the newer employees and the interns, who were thriving under the new system. They felt they had a voice, and they appreciated the company's commitment to their growth. The veteran employees, who had initially been resistant, were starting to come around. They had seen the tangible benefits of the changes, particularly in the lower turnover rates and the increased job satisfaction among their colleagues. While not all of them had embraced the full scope of the changes, the majority were beginning to accept the new direction. James knew that the company wasn't perfect, and the work wasn't finished. But he also knew that they were on the right track. The adjustments he had made, carefully, strategically, were paying off. The company was more unified, more engaged, and more capable of sustaining its growth. The next step would be to continue building on this foundation. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But James was confident that the bakery was on the cusp of something bigger. With a renewed focus on employee development, leadership training, and a strengthened brand, he knew the company would continue to evolve into a business that was not just profitable but meaningful. The future was bright, and although the journey had its hurdles, James felt more certain than ever that the company was poised for long-term success. James Caldwell had worked tirelessly to implement the changes he believed would transform the company. After months of restructuring and redefining company culture, the improvements were visible. Employees were more confident in their work. Their attitudes toward customer service had improved significantly, and there was an undeniable sense of camaraderie that had started to take root in the company. James felt a sense of accomplishment as he watched his team come together. But something still lingered in the back of his mind. Despite the progress, there were issues that hadn't been fully addressed. While the atmosphere had certainly improved, James could sense that not all was well in the company's inner workings. Reports started trickling in from a few concerned employees about unusual occurrences, important documents going missing, irregularities in financial transactions, and strange behavior from certain longtime employees. James, ever the meticulous leader, couldn't ignore these anomalies. Although everything on the surface seemed stable, he felt a nagging sense that there was something more beneath it all. His instincts told him that these oddities weren't isolated incidents. There was more to it than just administrative oversight or simple mistakes. With the company's recent changes, James had expected some resistance. But this felt different, deeper, more deliberate. It wasn't long before he decided to investigate further. James knew he couldn't allow any issues, no matter how small, to fester and undermine the progress he'd worked so hard to build. He requested a full internal investigation, focusing not only on the financial irregularities but also on the way the management structure was functioning. As he dug deeper, it became increasingly clear that these weren't just mistakes. James discovered that a small group of longtime employees had been manipulating certain financial operations for their own personal gain. They had been quietly using their influence to take advantage of the company's new training programs, funneling resources into their own pockets while presenting themselves as model employees. This group had been operating under the radar, hiding their actions behind the ongoing cultural shifts. The financial manipulation wasn't just a one-off occurrence, it was a pattern. A well-organized scheme that had been running parallel to the company's attempts at reform. It became evident that some of the employees, particularly those who had resisted the changes, were using the company's growing disarray as an opportunity to cover up their wrongdoings. James felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. These were the very people who had been complaining about change, about the need to go back to the way things were. And now it turned out they were part of the problem all along. As James investigated further, the pieces started to fall into place. It wasn't just about finances. It was also about the trust he had placed in his team. These employees had been taking advantage of the systems that were meant to be part of the company's growth, using their positions to line their pockets while undermining the very values James had been trying to instill. It felt like a betrayal on a personal level. James realized that the cultural changes he had implemented weren't enough to root out the corruption. He'd been focused on changing attitudes, improving customer service, and enhancing the work environment. But he had failed to see that the deeper issues, the ones embedded in the company's older systems, were still alive and well. The heart of the company, the moral foundation, was being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. Determined to get to the bottom of it, James took swift action. He initiated a comprehensive internal audit, not just focusing on the financial discrepancies but also reviewing all company activities. Nothing was off limits. Every department, every transaction, every person was now under scrutiny. He knew that if this was left unchecked, it would be more than just a few disgruntled employees. It could destroy everything he had built. Through the audit, James uncovered further evidence of the long-standing staff's involvement in fraudulent activities. They had used their seniority and influence to manipulate both internal processes and external relationships. The extent of their actions was staggering. They had taken advantage of the company's open-door policies, using their positions to bypass procedures and line their pockets with company resources. It became clear to James that these weren't just small-time errors or lapses in judgment. This was a deliberate effort to maintain control over the company's operations and shield themselves from the changes James had so carefully set into motion. These employees had used the chaos surrounding the cultural transformation as cover for their actions. And now it was up to James to make sure the truth came to light. The more James uncovered, the more he realized that the fight for the company's future wasn't over. The changes he had made, while necessary, had uncovered deep-seated issues that went far beyond resistance to new ideas. This was a battle for the very soul of the company, and James couldn't afford to lose. He scheduled a meeting with the senior management team. The gravity of the situation weighed on him, but he knew that it was the right time to act. "We can't move forward until we deal with this head-on," James told them. "The culture change we've been pushing for can't succeed if we have people inside the company who are undermining it. We need to confront this and clean house if necessary. Trust has to be restored across the board, and we need to show everyone that this behavior will not be tolerated." James's voice was firm, But there was an undertone of frustration. It was difficult for him to accept that the very people who had fought against change were the ones sabotaging his efforts. But he knew he had to be strong. He could not afford to back down. Not now. As the investigation continued, James felt a growing sense of resolve. He knew this would be the final test for his leadership. The company was in a vulnerable state, but he was determined to root out the corruption and rebuild the trust that had been shattered. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But James was ready. He had already made the changes that were necessary for the company to move forward. And now it was time to address the final obstacle. The secret dealings within the company were a wake-up call for James. It was a harsh reminder that change was never simple, and that even the most well-intentioned reforms could be hijacked by those unwilling to let go of old ways. But as he looked at the steps ahead, he felt more confident than ever that with the right actions, he could steer the company into a new era, one that was free from the shadows of corruption and full of promise for the future. The battle was far from over, but James Caldwell was ready to fight for the soul of his company. As we wrap up this story, one thing is clear. Leadership is not just about making decisions in boardrooms, it's about listening, acting with integrity, and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The CEO in this story took a stand against toxic behavior, choosing to foster a culture of respect and fairness. It's a reminder to all of us that the right choices aren't always the easiest, but they are always the ones that shape a better future. What do you think? How do you think you would have handled the situation? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Before you go, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Undercover Truths for more stories that inspire change and challenge the status quo. Thank you for your support. Let's keep these important conversations going.